the politics of Putin, the masculinist politics, the kind of hyper-masculinism, the hyper-nationalism, the anti people who are not like us sentiment. That politics, that identity politics, and the politics of strength that Putin conveys is, in a different context, the exact politics of the American foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Hostile.
So we're 5 weeks into this war. Russia is changing tactics, it looks like. You have called this the end of the beginning, essentially. Can you elaborate on that, Paul?
Yeah, I use the phrase "the end of the beginning." Somebody famous once said, maybe it was in World War II, right? This is not the beginning of the end; it's the end of the beginning. And I think that's, for me, that's important to stress. And of course, I could be wrong, but especially with talk over the last week and a half about negotiations in Turkey, Russia changing tactics, I think there's been some optimism that maybe we were getting to an end to this conflict. And I don't share that confidence. My reading is that we are not looking at the beginning of the end of this conflict, but we are getting to the end of the beginning. To put it slightly differently, we're at the stage in a war where it turns from being a sprint into being a marathon. If for the first 3, 4, 5 weeks of this war, everything was about how quickly you could do things, right? How quickly could the Russians invade and surround Kiev? How quickly could the Ukrainians mount a response? How quickly could Western governments get arms to Ukraine in time to stop this, right? I remember in the first week of the war, I was emailing my friends with connections to the military, sort of saying, how quickly can we actually get stuff there, and how quickly can we get them trained up? It was about how quickly you could do things. Now, we're getting to the point where the question is, how long can you sustain things for? How long will can the West sustain the supplies of weapons? How long can the Russians sustain their logistics, which they've struggled with up to this point? How long can the Russians sustain the morale of their force? How long can the Ukrainians sustain the morale of their force? And there's so on. We could talk about refugees. How long can we sustain that effort? But the big point that I'm getting at is the question really, as we think about potentially moving towards a peace agreement, that's going to be shaped by events on the battlefield. And the real contest now in the battlefield is about sustaining things better than your opponent so that they have to retreat before you do.
So it seemed to me like Russia naturally had an advantage at the beginning when we were talking about like quick mobilization, at the very start of this war. And their goal was to take over Ukraine within a few days, right? Like essentially take over Kiev and install a new government. That didn't work. So is the West in Ukraine now at an advantage? Now it's a war of just sustaining at this point.
Yes and no. I think that the massive tactical advantage that Russia had at the beginning, they knew that they were going to attack. They knew when they were going to attack. That obviously was squandered. They didn't achieve what they wanted to. And so, in terms of foiling Russia's initial effort, Ukraine clearly scored a major victory, and by extension, the West. There's still plenty of room for things to go badly for Ukraine or go well for Russia. So the next phase of this war is not going to be about as much about surprise, but about the ability to mass forces. And here's exactly what I mean. Russia now looks like it's really going to focus on eastern and southern Ukraine, right? Can Ukraine transfer forces enough to stop Russia in eastern and southern Ukraine without leaving Kiev vulnerable to a renewed attack? And so it's so now what Russia is going to try to bring to bear as an asset is the larger scale of its armed forces.
How is this sustainable?
That has its own challenges.
Yeah. That's what I was wondering, is how is this sustainable for Russia? It seems a lot of their military commanders have been killed. They've used a lot of resources. And now with these sanctions, they are getting very, very close to the knife's edge here, right?
I think that's right. I think the big question over the next 5 to 10 weeks of this war is, can Russia successfully execute this strategy that's based on potentially advances on a large front in eastern and southern Ukraine, or multiple fronts in eastern and southern Ukraine, that by pressing on enough different places, they press more places than Ukraine can defend, and Ukraine just has to make choices about where it's going to give up territory.
Okay.
That depends on material factors, tanks, weaponry, and so on. It depends on resupply, particularly things like oil, but also spare parts, and it depends on numbers of troops. And we're going to find out. We're going to find out.
Okay, and so as far as this next phase of the war, let's call it the intermediate stage that's about to come up. You said it's
Yep.
it's going to be based on sustainability. There's multiple components to this. So it's part of it is how is Ukraine and Russia itself, how are their armed forces and supply lines going to be able to sustain themselves throughout this conflict? The other part is how is the rest of the Western response going to sustain itself? One of the major topics is this refugee crisis that's happening in Western Europe at this point, as there's all these Ukrainian refugees now moving westward. And you had mentioned to me earlier that this is a feature, not a bug, that Putin wants this to happen to destabilize the West and cause further polarization in the West. So can you elaborate on that?
Sure. I'm going to go back in time a little bit, right? In 2015, when Russia really got deeply involved, actually even before that, but when Russia got deeply involved in the Syrian conflict, one of the results of that was, of course, massive numbers of Syrian refugees. And many states of Western Europe, and Germany particularly, rose to the occasion, saying they would take something like 1 million refugees from Syria. That, I think, was a very noble thing for Germany to do, but it proved to be divisive within Germany. And two different kind of issues were stoked by the massive influx of Syrian refugees into Europe, along with sort of an ongoing problem with refugees from the African continent. One problem was within countries. The more refugees you had, the more people got cranky about them, and it sort of fed populist right-wing parties. But the other argument, and these overlapped, was an argument between countries about who should be taking how many refugees and who should be paying for them. And I think Russia clearly learned that was kind of a winner for them. So in 2021, right, last summer, fall, Belarus, which is really controlled by Russia now, very deliberately invited a whole bunch of Syrians and helped them get to Belarus, and then took them out to the border with Poland and had them essentially walk across the border with Poland to basically create a refugee crisis in Poland. And Poland responded by essentially not letting them in. And it was, and these people were out there in the cold. It was horrible. They were just used as pawns. So to the current conflict, right, there's now 4 or 5 million people who have left Ukraine, and another probably equal number that are displaced within Ukraine. That's the biggest movement of refugees in Europe since World War II. And in the short term, the Western Europe has responded spectacularly. And I am guessing, without knowing, of course, I'm guessing that Putin is thinking to himself, well, let's see how long you can keep that up. Both domestically, in terms of the hardship of housing and feeding and sustaining people, but also then politically, to what extent does resentment come domestically? And to what extent do countries like Poland, which is absorbing by far the largest numbers, begin to get cranky with France or the United States or the UK, who really have taken very few so far?
Yeah, so I want to talk
So there's a
about that.
lot of potential.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
want to talk about how sustainable this is. So obviously, it's a major humanitarian crisis that's happening. At the same time, how much negative economic pressure does this create in these nations who are taking in immigrants? Does it create economic pressures? Is there long-term positives that could come of this for their economies?
Well, for some of the countries of Western Europe, because internal birth rates have gone to below replacement rates, really immigration is the only way to keep the population steady or growing, which is important economically. These are, generally speaking, pretty wealthy countries, and the European as a whole, and if you throw in the United States and Canada, the wealth is there, but it to help all these folks out. But of course, the wealth is also there to solve a lot of problems in our countries that we haven't been solving,
Hmm.
because of course the politics is not always there,
Yeah.
and that really becomes the issue.
So
It
some of these
is
countries
it
are a lot
is
more like homogeneous cultures, though, right? They're not necessarily like you look at
yep,
the Scandinavian countries and stuff like that. If you
yep,
talk about, okay, they have declining
yep.
birth rates, but then maybe part of your population is going to be replaced by Syrians or Ukrainians. Are they going to be receptive to that?
Well, I think that is one of the things that has become controversial. And when you say they being receptive, it depends a lot, on the individuals. But
Mm-hmm.
that's a thing on which some people disagree. I think people have people, especially who are advocates for refugees from the Middle East, from Central Asia, from Afghanistan, from Africa, um, have been, I think, angered at the fact that because Ukrainians, you know, have the same skin color and hair color and eye color and so on as a lot of Western Europeans, that the Western Europeans seem a lot more willing to let them in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so there appears to be this double standard, and I'm afraid that might. I guess what I would say is not letting Ukrainians in doesn't help more Syrians get in,
Mm-hmm.
and so there is some danger that pointing out that double standard doesn't do anybody any good.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I could tell you, where I teach here in Riverside, California, and I've had several people comment to me. Basically, we have all these undocumented people in the United States. We have people who are desperate to get across the border from Mexico. Why all of a sudden so much focus on Ukrainians?
Mm-hmm.
We've
And
talked about
what
this
is your
previously.
yeah? So,
Um,
but what is your answer to them?
well, I think that my answer is that you did some version of two wrongs don't make a right, or there are distinct problems, and I don't think it makes a lot of sense to say I haven't gotten the thing that I want, so you shouldn't. So we should take we shouldn't take the problems of people from Central America out on the Ukrainians is what I would
Mm-hmm.
say. At the same time, we should be thinking hard about the problems of migration around the world, and those are some of the most divisive issues in American politics, and they're
Mm-hmm.
very divisive elsewhere as well. So I don't have any magic solution, um, and I don't think there are magical solutions. Integrating
Mm-hmm.
migrants is not easy.
Yeah. One of the things that you inferred essentially is that this refugee crisis, though, does increase right wing populism quite significantly, right?
Mhm.
So I
Yep,
think the most apparent example
yep,
of this is Viktor Orban in Hungary. Is that correct?
yep, yep, yep,
So essentially, or demagogic figures who then come to power. Um,
yep,
Closing
yep.
up borders, isolationists. We saw this here in the United States with some of Trump's language. Is this something
Mhm.
seriously like how worried should we be about this? Essentially, is what I'm asking.
Well, yeah, I think we should be pretty worried about the future of democracy in the United States. Um, Depending on who triumphs in some elections coming up in later this year and then in 2024, there are people competing for power in this country who don't seem very committed to democracy. So
And
I
what
would
we're
be
trying
worried.
to have a conversation here about is the threats to democracy, because once again this is coming
Yep,
down to these clear lines between democracy and autocracy, um, and
yep.
there are major threats to democracy and how we practice it here in the United States, especially. I think what like as this conflict has reaches its fifth week. What have you seen? Like,
Yep.
where is that needle pointing towards? Is it pointing towards it's gotten a little bit more favorable towards the Democratic side, or is it pointing towards that authoritarians are still very much a threat?
Yeah, this is a good question. And I think what's interesting, and this has actually been true for some time, is that the Republicans and Democrats in the United States Congress, for example, can't agree on what day of the week it is. They can't agree on whether the sun rises in the east or the west. The one thing they've been able to agree on is Russia. Um, but what is now interesting is there's now again become this very clear dividing line between the mainstream of the Republican Party, which is pretty far right of where it was 10 years ago, and a part of the Republican Party, which we didn't really pay any attention to 10 years ago, that has really really become this sort of pro-Putin wing of the Republican Party. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out in electoral politics, particularly in primary races in the Republican Party over the next year. I mean, my sense is that very few Republicans would vote for a Democrat, even if the alternative was voting for a pro-Putin Republican. That's still kind of the key decision. It used to be that there was this whole middle of American political opinion, the so-called swing voters, who would swing this way or swing that way. And now politics is much more just about mobilizing your base. And as we saw in the whole discussion of the January 6th situation, there are very, very few Republicans that are willing to, quote unquote, go against the party, even when they feel the party has done something outrageous, because they do not want to benefit the Democrats.
Well, why is there pro-Putin rhetoric on the far right now? Like, what do they have to gain? Are they just anything that Biden does is just bad automatically? Is that why?
That's part of it, and on the far right, there's the sense that the mainstream Republicans, right, are not to be trusted. That's really where Trump came from, was an attack on mainstream Republicanism. But I think there's this much closer affinity that we need to pay attention to, which is the politics of Putin, the masculinist politics, the kind of hyper-masculinism, the hyper-nationalism, the anti-people who are not like us sentiment. That politics, that identity politics, and the politics of strength that Putin conveys is, in a different context, the exact politics of the American far right. Right? Hostile to European liberalism, hostile to immigrants, hostile to people of color, hostile to gay, transgender, etc., and to toleration of gay and transgender people. That's actually an agenda they all share.
And is this?
And so it's not surprising.
It's not surprising. Is this getting worse, though? I mean, is it getting more? Because it seemed to be a period where we did become more tolerant, that we did become more accepting, and then how do you have seen that change over the past couple of decades?
Well, boy, you really do want me to talk about stuff I'm not an expert on. This is my impression, right? This is my impression. I always remind people of how much progress. Let's just take the issue of gay rights, right? Barack Obama, what most people regard as sort of a liberal Democrat, Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, right? Not yet 15 years ago, ran for president in 2008 with saying that he was against gay marriage, right? That's where the United States was 14 years ago. Within a few years, it was a done deal, right? Gay marriage was the law of the land in all 50 states. So I think what's interesting is that while a lot of people on the left have this sense of being under attack, on the right, of people who are against gay marriage, they have this sense that they've sustained this enormous losses in cultural politics over the last 15 years. And so they're the ones. And what I'm saying is, I think what's interesting in American politics is that both people on the left and right, whatever even that means now, have this sense that they're the ones who are put upon, and they're the ones in danger of losing everything that is important to them.
Yeah. No, well said, Paul.
When in fact, I should say, in fact, my view of it is I think the changes that took place roughly between 2008 and 2012 were stuff that 5 or 10 years earlier seemed hopelessly far out in the future. And so what you now have is a whole lot of people who lived most of their lives believing pretty reasonably that they would never live in a country that tolerated gay marriage. And now they are having to live in that country, and they're not used to it yet, and they haven't made their peace with it yet, and there's a backlash. I am guessing that down the road, with generational change, that'll fade into the background, just like a lot of other things have. But at least for the time being, there still seems to be a lot of political gain to be had in politicizing that stuff.
And the reason we're talking about this is really, I mean, in the context of the Ukraine and Russian war, is because identity politics has become such a hot button issue, and it is causing such a division amongst Western societies, and to some degree, we are kind of
Yep.
playing into Putin's hand when we are so polarized. I want to switch real quick and just talk
Well, let
about
me just
yeah.
okay.
Go ahead, Paul.
Well, let me just say, I think one of the ways in which Putin's invasion of Ukraine has turned out to be a massive blunder is the fact that it has driven a lot of coming together in Western societies. That while he may still be hoping to drive these wedges, I actually think he's losing that battle.
Mm-hmm.
In part because, I mean, Tucker Carlson can say what he wants, but in all across the West, it has become an extremist position to not think that Putin is something approaching the Antichrist.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in that sense, I think Putin's actually given away an immense amount politically in the West.
Yeah, and I just to piggyback on that, I do think that when there is like periods of long peace and prosperity, that actually increases the odds of internal polarization to some degree, because then we're arguing over topics that may not even make sense to a lot of people. But then when there's a clear enemy, that does seem to unite people around the real threats to the world, essentially, right? We start seeing more clearly what's
I think that's
important
right.
and what's not so important. Let's talk about
Yep.
just the bigger implications, like the second and third order effects of this war. Like, for instance, we know that Ukraine and Russia are some of the top food suppliers in the world. They a percentage, I think it's up to 15% of the grain on this planet could be coming from those regions. So let's talk about what impact that's going to have now worldwide.
Yeah, I think this is something we need to pay a lot more attention to than we have. There's two separate problems. One is within Ukraine itself, where the spring planting is not getting done and the harvest of the winter wheat is not getting done. And in the short term, I think there's danger, not right now, but 5, 6 months from now, maybe next year, there's danger of famine in Ukraine. And I always point out that going back to 1932, 33, right, there's a history of Russia / the Soviet Union using famine as a way to basically break the back of Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian national identity. About 4 million people, best estimates, starved to death in 1932, 33 in Ukraine because the Soviet government created a program that basically took all the food from those farming areas and moved it to cities. Meant in part to feed workers in cities and in part, again, to break the Ukrainian peasantry.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the sort of first order problem. But the second order problem is what's happening to food prices around the world. And if you're living the way I live in California, then if you go to the grocery store and whatever you're buying, costs 20% more than it did last week, that's a bummer. But I'm still going to eat. Think about all the people all over the world who are really, their budget's on an edge every week. And 20% more for your wheat or for your bread or for whatever your staples are, that might be the difference between fully feeding your family and not fully feeding your family. And so what I worry about, sort of the second order effect, is in lots of places all over the world, an increase in food prices leading to an increase in malnutrition at best, sort of undernourishment at best, all the way through to like real famine. And then the third order effect is when people are hungry or when people are struggling to feed their families, right? That's when protests against governments, that's when revolutions happen. There's a pretty good correlation between food price hikes and social unrest around the world.
So this could be a
So
major
that may be where we're headed. And
destabilizing
those things
force.
can happen very far from Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yep. And so I think there needs to be a lot of thought about how to manage those kind of second and third order effects in places thousands of miles from Russia and Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Is that a logistics issue or an actual food production issue? Because we have so much food waste, we almost have food abundance to this degree, yet many people around the
Yeah.
world still starve, they go hungry. What can we do to change that? I know.
I'm laughing because it's another question. It's like, okay, I know a little bit about this, Sarish, but I'm not an expert on poverty or on the
Yeah,
global food chain. Even though I brought it up, I've just told you everything I
yeah,
really know. Um,
yeah.
I mean, this is a problem the world's been grappling with for decades, or really for forever, right? There's been famines for a long time, and actually, since World War II and the Green Revolution, the amount of famine in the world has decreased dramatically.
Hmm.
Dramatically, especially in places like India and China, where massive famines in which millions of people died, used to be a sort of periodic, regular
Hmm.
occurrence. Um, I think there's, I mean, I think there's, it's partly a supply problem. It's partly a problem about the amount of food. But as you're pointing out, there's probably in some abstract sense enough food to feed everybody. What I think it becomes is a price problem, which is that there may be food in places, but because it's driven by global markets, the price may go up to the point where some people find it difficult to afford it.
Is
And in
Russia
theory, one could do things with. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, is Russia going to face the same type of conditions? You said they could starve Ukraine out, but will Russia actually go through the same circumstances?
I don't think so, because the war is not being fought really in Russian territory. Um, so that I would maybe point to a couple of things. One is, the Russian farmers have not had to leave their territory because there's a war being fought there. I think to a much lesser extent than in Ukraine, Russian farm tractors are not getting sort of commandeered for military service.
Hmm.
And then the last thing I would point out is Russia does have plenty of supplies of fuel, which, agriculture is pretty fuel intensive. Russia has plenty of supplies of fuel, but meanwhile, Russia is bombing the fuel supplies in Ukraine,
Hmm.
um, bombing diesel storage facilities just at the time when you want to fill up tractors and go plow the earth for the spring planting or go reap the wheat that you planted last fall.
Hmm.
Um, so I don't think it's going to be as much of a problem in Russia per se, but for the poorest Russians, there will be the same effect that as prices of things go up, those people on the margins are going to find it tougher and tougher to make ends meet.
Hmm. So essentially, when we first started these conversations over a month ago, um, one of the things that we discussed was how this affects people living in this country. You had a student actually come up to you and said, why should I care
Yeah,
about this
yeah,
conflict in Ukraine?
yep,
Russia's invading Ukraine. What does it affect
yep,
me? I think the consequences have
yep.
become a lot more apparent right now. What would you be telling that same
Yep.
student today? I mean, what do you share to people who still might not really understand the full implications of this crisis?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's two sides of this. One is sort of why I still think it's incredibly important to support Ukraine. I actually think this more strongly now than I did a month ago, that it is absolutely essential for the US, for the West, for democracy in the world, for kind of everything we believe in. It's essential that Russia not win this war.
Hmm.
And it's essential that Ukraine win, whatever that means. And we could talk about that. But to the same point that I just raised, I put gas in my car yesterday and paid over $6 a gallon for it. Um, if you're living in California and commuting like a lot of people do a long way to a job, you've all of a sudden taken a massive, massive hit in your budget. And I think there's a lot of hardship um, forced onto people because of increases in fuel prices. And those increases in fuel prices are maybe not necessarily entirely due to this war, but the war is a big part of it. And so, um, on the one hand, we can make the case about why it's important to support Ukraine, but we also have to acknowledge that in very direct ways now, American people are suffering as a result of this conflict.
So there is going to be an increase in the prices that people are paying at the pump, at the grocery store. And this tying it back to some of the conversation we had earlier, Europe is really taking the brunt of the refugees. What does it look like on the United States' end?
Yeah, the United States hasn't done much yet. The the Biden administration has said some of the right things. They said, I was a week or two now ago, that they were going to take another 100,000 Ukrainians. Well, that's a great thing to say in a speech, but as far as I've been able to tell, and I've been looking pretty hard, there's not actually been any steps to put that into law or to put that into practice.
Mm-hmm.
And if so, sort of what does it mean? And of course, it's equally the case that 100,000 people would be great, but again, in the context of 4 million refugees, it's pretty limited. But as soon as Biden says 100,000 Ukrainians, right, there are advocacy groups for bunches of other potential migrants and refugees and asylum seekers from different parts of the world saying, what about us? And so it, as we have already talked about, it touches on one of the most politically tricky issues in the country. And it's a politically a tricky issue within the Democratic Party. And I think Biden is probably hoping to talk about it and to deal with it as little as possible, because it's not quite the third rail of American politics, but it's pretty close.
Mm-hmm. Meaning it's very hard, that it has the tendency to polarize people the most is this issue right here, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
What hope do we have for a ceasefire? You said it's the end of the beginning. I mean, what hope is there at this point from your analysis for a ceasefire where both sides decide to say, we're going to stop this conflict. It's gone on too far. Ukraine might give up some concessions, but Russia will essentially say, we're going to stop this war. What are the chances of that?
This is speculation. I think within the next month or so, the chances of that are 5 to 10%.
Mm-hmm.
I can give you an optimistic scenario if you want.
Sure, please.
You want an optimistic scenario? Okay, so the optimistic scenario is the Russian advances around Kiev have been halted. Russian troop losses, material losses have been very high. The sanctions have been a lot more than the Russians anticipated. The Russians have then a good reason at this point to want to get out, right, to stop the war. At the same time, the Ukrainians have sent signals that they're willing to essentially accept one thing that Russia has said was important, which is not joining NATO or some kind of neutrality. I think the tougher question would be agreeing for Ukraine to agree to accept Russia's control of Crimea or Russia's control of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. I think there's a case to be made that there's a potential solution there, right? The Ukrainians have floated the idea of some kind of 15-year freeze on Crimea so that that problem would just get kicked down the road. And maybe in 15 years, you could have a referendum or something on where Crimea was going to be. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that you could do something similar regarding Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. Right? That would be the basis, maybe, for a ceasefire or maybe actually an end to the war. Mm-hmm. That's an optimistic scenario because I don't think it's going to happen.
Well, I appreciate the optimism. I mean, it's good to have one scenario in mind. One of the fears right now that I've read is that Putin is more cut off than ever, and that his generals and his close inner circle is feeding him false information, essentially, at this point about how the war is going. They're essentially feeding him what he wants to hear. That obviously changes his tactics and his response. How scared should we be of that, of further escalation then, based on Putin's decision-making?
I'm going to answer that, but I got to go back to what I said previously just for a second, which is that, what I just called an optimistic scenario is to many Ukrainians anathema, right? The idea that any Ukrainian territory gets surrendered to Russia. A lot of people have been saying, no, that is not acceptable. Why should we have to give away territory to stop somebody from illegally invading us? There are those who are still going to say we shouldn't give up, just on principle. We shouldn't give up We shouldn't let others force us to choose neutrality. So I want to point out that when I say optimism, we should probably put that in some kind of air quotes. Optimism, if all you really want is to end the war. Okay, so the question of Putin's isolation, I think this is a big issue. I think there's an interesting column by Paul Krugman in today's New York Times to the effect, and Krugman is speculating, and he admits that he's speculating, that Russia, Putin may not only be being misled about the state of affairs of the military struggle, but that he's probably or potentially being misled about the state of the Russian economy, because people don't want to tell him things that he doesn't want to hear. And so as long as, again, they can sort of create enough propaganda that says things are going swell economically, it might be then that the economic problems are not really going to compel him to do anything because he may not see them. So yeah, I think it's a big problem for Ukraine and the West as it thinks about how to try to shape Russian behavior, but it's an increasingly big problem for Russia itself, because in the medium to long term, reality sooner or later will be brought to bear. You can close your eyes to a lot of stuff for a long time, but usually the longer you close your eyes, the bigger it hits you when reality finally does hit. So just to give one example, all the fabrications that have been the heart of Russia's strategy in terms of its domestic public opinion. In the short term, that's great. Russians believe that the Ukrainians are Nazis, that the war is going swimmingly, and so on and so forth. Sooner or later, the more and more young Russian men come home in coffins or just disappear off the face of the earth because they don't bring them home in coffins, the harder it is to get to sustain that. And when the Russian people kind of do again what they did in the 1980s, which is come to realize that they cannot trust a single thing that their government says, all of a sudden that government propaganda goes from being a very powerful tool to being utterly ineffective because nobody believes anything they say. And so that's the hazard that Russia now runs. And a related affair or a related problem is, one of the things you typically do in a war is you want to convince people of why they need to sacrifice their sons and daughters. By arguing that everything is going swimmingly, it's hard for Putin then to say at the same time, but we need more people to enlist. And so fighting the war effectively at some point is undermined by lying about how the war is going. And they'll have to cope with that.
Is another Russian revolution a good or bad thing for the rest of the world?
That's a great question. I don't think it's going to happen. And if it happens, it won't be another revolution. It would be a new, completely different Russian revolution. Our president, Joe Biden, as you're aware, got a lot of attention last week for basically saying Putin's got to go. I think a lot of people feel that way, but it's an outcome the West has no ability to bring about. He will go eventually, of course, by natural causes, if nothing else. I'm not especially optimistic that the departure of Putin will solve all of the problems we have with Russia or that Russia has internally. But more so now than than the week before this war started, I do believe that Putin is a big part of the problem. This war has changed my view on that. I've always thought he was a big part of the problem, but I would have said 6 weeks or 2 months ago that if Putin died tomorrow, he would get replaced by somebody who's just as bad. I think he's now become what I now think of Putin, what we now see of Putin makes me think, he's bad enough that maybe somebody else wouldn't be quite so bad. I'm not convinced, in other words, that the entire Russian elite would want to invade Ukraine or would want to pay the cost that Russia is paying for this war. I don't think they're going to overthrow him, but
I think
in the long term,
Well, it just remains to be seen at the end of the day, right? It remains to be seen how this goes. I think in China there's this idea of the bad emperor problem that every now and then you're just going to
Yep.
get a bad dude who's in power and
Yep.
he's going to cause devastating
Yep.
consequences. But then sometimes there is a silver lining and someone great comes out of that. Maybe the example is. From Mao to Deng Xiaoping, there was a very
Mhm.
clear line
Yep.
between how they operated and,
Yep.
their policies, right? So we can be hopeful. Let's see how it goes. We'll continue this discussion, and we can just only hope that these humanitarian crisis that's unfolding right now, this actual war that's taking place, all of these things do hopefully start to see some sort of resolution. But it's hard to say still at this point. And as you said, it's still the end of the beginning. So we potentially have a long winter still ahead of us. Thank you so much, Paul. And we'll continue next weekend.
You're welcome.